This is a brief introduction to meta-analyses. Now, the first question you might want to ask is, what is a meta-analysis? It's kind of a funny sounding word. Well, a meta-analysis is basically an analysis of various analyses. That's why it's called a meta-analysis, because it's an analysis of analyses. That's what meta means. And so basically what it's doing is combining lots of quantitative studies together to see what we can learn, to see if an effect is really true, because maybe some studies will say that the effect exists, other studies will show that it doesn't. We're combining them all to see what types of conclusions that we make, as well as to see if we can use the information that we get by comparing different studies to make new conclusions, such as when does the phenomena exist and under what conditions does it exist, or under what conditions is it stronger. Now, the basic principle is that we're going to take a lot of studies, we're going to look at the results, and we're going to basically combine them or average them. And the way that we're going to do that is focusing on effect sizes. Now, hopefully you know what an effect size is, and because that's fundamental to a meta-analysis. You might want to watch the video on effect sizes if you're not familiar with effect sizes. For example, a meta-analysis that I worked on was looking at the relationship between personality traits and the likelihood of using a specific conflict style called cooperation when conflicts occur. So the personality trait conscientiousness measures how closely someone pays attention to rules or does what they're supposed to do or arrives on time. And people that are highly conscientious are the ones that always arrive on time. Those who are a little less high on conscientiousness might not arrive on time often. And then the conflict style I was looking at was cooperation. And that's where you kind of like overcome your emotions to fight or withdraw, but say, hey, let's talk about and negotiate a solution to this conflict. Here's what my interests are. I want to hear what your interests are. Let's see if we can come up with some type of solution that will respond to all the to each party's interests, so that we can come up with the optimal solution. Now, we would kind of expect there to be a relationship between conscientiousness and cooperation, because cooperation takes a lot of work. You have to overcome your emotions to do it. And conscientious people are generally willing to put in the work necessary to accomplish the task. Well, looking at 4 different studies, in the first study, the correlation was minus 0.02, so it was virtually nothing between conscientiousness and cooperation, and it was negative. People that were more conscientious were less cooperative. There were 142 people in this study, and P equaled 0.81. This was not a significant relationship. Similarly, in a second study, the correlation equaled 0.04 with 92 people. P equals 0.71. Once again, not significant. Now, just looking at these 2 studies, you might come to the conclusion that, oh, there's no relationship between conscientiousness and cooperation. But in the next 2 studies, that also had hundreds of people, they had a very significant result of R equals 0.33 and R equals 0.35. So what we want to do in a meta-analysis is take a weighted average of all these correlations, and we can report that as an estimated population correlation. So we're using rho, the Greek letter for R, to indicate what our estimate for the population is. We estimated that there was a correlation of 0.22. K is the number of studies, so out of 4 studies with a total sample size of 671, and the probability of getting that type of correlation by chance is less than 0.001. So this meta-analysis will lead us to conclude that, yeah, there probably is this relationship between conscientiousness and cooperation when conflict occurs. But we might wonder, when does that occur? And so meta-analyses can detect moderators. And a moderator is a condition that changes the strength of a relationship. For example, a moderator would, when a moderator is high, maybe the correlation is high. When the moderator is low, maybe the correlation is low. And it turns out that there was a very strong moderator in this study. When we studied college students, or when the studies that looked at college students, typically people between the ages of 18 and 25, that was the first two studies. There was no correlation between conscientiousness and cooperation. However, in studies that looked at working adults who were older and more mature, that's when we had the correlations that were really strong. And so we can see that age is a marker of the relationship between conscientiousness and cooperation. Now, an interesting question is, why would that be? Perhaps because working adults know that they need to get things done, whereas college students, they're when they get into a conflict, sometimes the best solution is just to withdraw from it or to accommodate, and so they might not use conscientiousness to solve a problem as much as they would to avoid escalating the problem. So cooperation might not be their first choice in order to solve it. But with adults who are working, you've got to solve the problems, and so the more conscientious people would be willing to make that effort. So the conclusion is that since this relationship between the two main variables changes with a third variable, age, we say that age is a moderator, and that's one of the things that meta-analyses are really good at finding. Now let's look at a meta-analysis as an example. We're going to choose one. The title of this paper is A Meta-Analysis of the Relationship Between Organizational Citizenship Behavior and Counterproductive Work Behavior. So let me get that paper up here. Okay, let's see. So here's the paper, and I've downloaded it. And I think there's a link in the PowerPoint that you can use. And so here's the paper. Now, the first thing you want to do is you want to understand the title, and that's true of all journal articles. Sometimes they're not easy to understand. So this is entitled A Meta-Analysis. So that means they're going to put together a lot of studies that have been done together on the relationship. So that means we're going to be looking at a correlation rather than, which is one of the main effect sizes. You remember that the other main effect size that we use is Cohen's d, which measures the differences between two groups. But here we're going to look at the correlation or the relationship between organizational citizenship behavior. And so organizational citizenship behaviors, or OCBs as they're usually called, are behaviors that help out people or the organization that aren't on somebody's job description. So that's like helping somebody with a project, or maybe encouraging somebody who's down, or working extra hours when a deadline is approaching so that the company will be successful. And so those are called OCBs. And OCBs are really good because they're a good predictor of organizational success, how much other people are going to like the worker, how hard that worker is going to work. There's just all kinds of great things associated with OCBs. And then there's counterproductive work behavior, which is kind of the opposite. And those are CWBs. Those are things that people do at work that work against other people, like trying to compete or to undercut somebody, maybe stealing things from the company, cheating on their time card, all kinds of bad things that people can do in organizations to hurt other people or to hurt the organizations. So this article is going to look at the relationship between OCBs and CWBs. Now, we would kind of guess that they're negatively correlated, and because they've got good on one side, bad on the other, but maybe they're not. Maybe there's plenty of good people that do plenty of bad things too, and there's a lot of people that do neither good nor bad things. So we're going to look at this in detail, and I want to show you some of the things that you're going to want to to point out. Well, you certainly want to read the abstract to find out what was going on here. I'm just going to dive in and look at what's highlighted here, what I've highlighted, that the important things are. The first thing is that you want to make sure you know what the meta-analysis is looking at, the OCBs and the CWBs. And then you want to look at specifically what this meta-analysis is doing. And here it says, the present research uses meta-analysis to estimate the strength of relationship between OCB and CWB at both the global and facet levels. Ooh, what does that mean? Global and facet levels. Global means looking at OCB as one global construct, one global variable, and the same thing as CWB, but we can divide that into different categories. Maybe OCBs that are good for people, or OCBs that are good for the company, maybe OCBs that involve time, maybe OCBs that involve effort, maybe OCBs that involve money. We don't know yet. They're just saying that they're going to look at some facet levels. And then it says we're going to estimate these construct relationships with a common set of antecedents. Okay, so they're going to look at what precedes OCBs and CWBs. Now, normally what we're interested in is what causes them. But causation you can't really demonstrate in a correlational study. You need to do experiments, and we're just going to be combining correlational studies. But we can say, look at, well, what precedes OCBs in times? What kind of predicts them? And so it's kind of, these are most likely things that cause OCBs and CWBs. But we're not going to say that they cause, we're just going to call them antecedents, just looking at the time aspect of them. And then we're going to try to determine whether the magnitude of the OCB-CWB relationship is moderated by other variables. So does the strength of the relationship change with other variables? So then it goes on and describes what an OCB is and also what a CWB is. And you want to keep these definitions really clear in your mind when you're working through a meta-analysis, because otherwise you just get lost in the details and all these abbreviations. You want to be really clear on what the basic constructs are. Now here it talks about dimensionality, or the facets that they're going to be looked at. And so Organ, that was the guy who developed a lot of the information OCBs. He reported two dimensions of OCB, namely an interpersonal dimension and an organizational dimension. So these are the two facets that we're going to be looking at. So the OCBs that you do to another person, those are going to be the OCB interpersonal, OCBI, and those that you do for the well-being of the organization, OCBO. And similarly, we're going to have CWBI, such as gossiping about other coworkers and putting them down, or CWB for the organization, things that hurt the organization, such as taking long breaks. So each of the two main constructs we're going to break down into these two facets. Now here we come to the research questions, and these are the basic things that the author is trying to answer. What is the magnitude of the relationship between OCB and CWB? How strong is this relationship? And then research question 2 is, what's the magnitude of the relationship between OCB and CWB directed towards the same target and directed towards different targets? So we're going to take both forms of OCB, both the individual and the organization, and we're going to see how that's related to CWBs, both for the individual and the organization. For example, is it common for people to be nice to other coworkers, but to totally thrash the organization and do lots of things that hurt it? We're going to also look at they're going to consider different antecedents, and this describes the different antecedents that they're going to examine in the study, such as job attitudes, what their attitude towards their job is, their organizational justice, that's their perception of how fair people are at their job. They're going to look at conscientiousness, a personality trait, to see if that is related to OCBs and CWBs. They're going to look at positive and negative effect. There's some people that have a lot more positive emotions than others. Other people have a lot more negative emotions. Some people have lots of positive and lots of negative, and some people don't have very much of either. So they're going to look at both the positive and negative emotions and see how those are related to OCBs and CWBs. And then they're going to try to answer the question, do OCB and CWB exhibit similar patterns of relationships with antecedents? You'd kind of expect them to be opposites if they do. So they're going to examine that. And they're going to look for potential moderator variables. And the ones that they're going to look for are the source of the ratings. Maybe when people do self-reports, they're not going to see themselves as purely good versus purely evil, whereas maybe supervisors might see a stronger correlation between OCB and CWB. The type of survey that they're having, this inclusion of antithetical items is a methodological question. The format of response questions is another methodological question. That doesn't have too many applications for organizational psychology directly, but if we can see that you get different results with different methods, we should be aware of that. So here we have the next thing is the inclusion criteria, and that's a set of rules that the authors use to decide which studies they should include in the study. So they describe how they chose things to choose. They describe the literature search they did to find these articles. And their conclusion was that they found 49 independent samples from 38 articles. 38 studies. So they have 38 papers that they're combining that include a total of 49 different samples, and that's what they're going to base a meta-analysis on. And they put these 49 samples together, and they provide the demographic and characteristics of the participants, and also the characteristics of the studies. And so we get some information there. Now we get to the results section, and we have, first of all, the relationship between global constructs. That's what we were looking at. What's the average correlation between OCBs and CWBs? And we have the results here. We've got the mean R, that's a weighted correlation, and then the mean rho, where they estimate the population correlation from the average R. So it was around minus 0.3. So not a real strong negative relationship, but the 90% confidence interval is completely negative. So this result is significant, and we can conclude that, yeah, there is a negative relationship between the OCBs and CWBs in general. The more OCBs you do, the fewer CWBs that you do, but it's not a real strong relationship. Right, now they look at the relationship between facets, since that was one of the research questions, and that's described in Table 4. And so we have the individual form of OCBs, the organizational form of OCBs, and the individual and organizational form of CWBs. And we can see that OCBs for the organization and the individual, they're strongly positively correlated. So people that do good things for other coworkers tend to do good things for workers. Workers that and the CWBI and CWBO are also strongly correlated. People that are destructive to other coworkers tend to be destructive to the company. And we can look at the CWB facets correlated with the OCB facets, and we see that they're generally negatively correlated, but not super strongly. So that shows how the facets are related. And then we have a section on presumed antecedents of organizational citizenship behavior and organizational counterproductive work behavior. And it turns out that what they did to report these was they just looked at other meta-analyses that had been done. So looking at job satisfaction and how that predicted OCB and job satisfaction and CWBs, they found people that had already done meta-analyses on these. And so like this is a meta-analyses, since they're combining meta-analyses in here. And generally, these antecedents, all job satisfaction, organizational satisfaction, commitment, organizational justice, conscientiousness, and positive effect were all positively associated with OCBs and negatively associated with CWBs, except negative affect, it was the opposite. It was negatively associated with OCBs and positively associated with CWBs. That's a combination there. And then they've got the moderator analysis, and they show the correlation under the two different conditions. For example, the source of the ratings. When the supervisor rated people on OCBs and CWBs, it's a real strong negative correlation, minus 0.60. But when the job incumbent, the person grading themselves, the employee, there was a weak relationship. And this makes sense because the supervisor sees fewer of the things that the employee does. So the supervisor tends to rate somebody as either all good or all bad. Oh, they do a lot of OCBs, they must not do very many CWBs. Oh, they do a lot of CWBs, they must not do very many OCBs. And so there's a strong relationship for supervisors, but for the job holder, when they rate themselves, they say, oh yeah, I steal sometimes, but I'm really nice to my neighbors. And so the correlation is much less strong if it's the a job holder rating it. So we say that the source of the ratings is a moderator. And so then it goes on and talks about some applications, and that's some of the key things that you want to be looking at when you go through a meta-analysis. Generally, you need to spend at least several hours working your way through a meta-analysis. You can't read through them real quickly, especially at the beginning. As always, when you read journal articles, spend lots of time looking up the words you don't know. Go to Wikipedia and look up those concepts. Go to your textbooks. Make sure you master these concepts so that when you read these really dense sentences, you'll be able to figure out what they're talking about. And so this has been an introduction to meta-analyses.